Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast with Mike and Mike. Sales is a thinking process. This podcast will help you learn about what works in sales, how to hone your skills, and increase your success. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and this episode we're going to talk about the journalist approach to asking questions. So Mike, start us off. What is the journalist approach?
Hey, Jody. The journalist approach is really this idea of how do I gather information to write a good story? And the traditional questions are the who, the what, the why, the where, the how. And sometimes this will be referred to or thought of as a 2-year-old approach. And we've been around 2-year-olds, and the most common question they ask is why. And as a sales rep, that can be a very valuable tool for you as you work to get to the root of the problem that you're trying to address inside the customer base. Why is something important? What would they do if they're not able to accomplish that? Who does it impact? If those people are impacted positively or negatively, why is that the case?
Yeah, and that's a good example, the 2-year-old approach. I actually have a 3-year-old grandson, and the why question, there's 2 flavors of that. There's the why, where they just want your attention, and so they're going to ask you why because you're finally communicating with them. But I also find a different version of that why, which is when he's in a learning mode and he's wanting to know what's going on around him, and it's something he hasn't seen before. He's got a natural curiosity. And, as much as we tell our kids and grandkids, stop asking why, I think that's unfortunate in some cases, because then as adults, we feel awkward about asking the question why. And I get pretty inspired when he starts asking why, when I know he's in a curiosity mode and he just wants to learn. That question leads to such great opportunities. And I think that's what we want to try and differentiate, certainly in this segment, is the difference between those whys and then really addressing some of the things that we know are out there in the world about training salespeople how to ask questions. And is it manipulative or is it actually serving a purpose? And really, that's what we want to tackle today.
Yeah, and you think about it from a manipulative standpoint. How many times are you in a situation where you get a question and you know that someone's trying to lead you down a path, and that path is not necessarily a good path? So one of the things that's really important in this approach is why with good intention. My intention is to get a better understanding of what the situation is so that I can determine, do I have a solution that fits? Am I working with the right people inside the organization? Ultimately, can I help? So intention is extremely important when considering this.
So it's called the journalist approach because you're using this approach just to uncover information. And you probably don't call it the 2-year-old approach because that has, we the 3 of us have had 2-year-olds, and that can be kind of annoying, their approach on how they do it. So how do you use this approach, always asking why, to not be annoying like the 2-year-old or not seem like you're just trying to uncover things that maybe you don't really need to know?
Yeah, I think the key there is how you're asking the why. If you sound like the 2-year-old and you're just saying, why? Obviously, you're going to get in that trap where you're putting the person you're talking to sort of in a defensive mode where they're really wondering what you're driving at or what your agenda is. And there's ways to ask the why. What you're really trying to do is express a natural curiosity that you have about what the person does or how they add value for their customers or wherever the case might be. And I think it's less about the word and it's more about how you're perceived as you're engaging in the conversation. And so there's ways to phrase a why where it's not just the, well, why, but putting some context around why you're curious about that particular point in the discussion is really what starts to separate it from just being the rote, just tell me why kind of questioning.
And another thing that's important is how that question changes, or those questions change depending on the customer or the person that you're working with. It should be based on research and not a template. This isn't 20 questions. It's not a list of questions that you go through. And in order to move the process forward, I've got to get an answer to each of these questions. That conversation should be valuable on both sides. So the customer should have value, or prospect should have value in sharing that information, or see value in sharing that information and getting information from you throughout that process. But you should also be cognizant of gathering information not to just put somebody in a box. It becomes really clear when someone is trying to get you into a box, and all of the questions are very targeted based on a process rather than questions that build on information that's shared. And this is where that reflective questioning really becomes important, or reflective listening really becomes important.
Yeah, because the why really, it's the internal question. And maybe that's another way to kind of look at this, is that as a salesperson or as anybody that's trying to have a meaningful conversation with somebody, the why is actually an internal question that I'm asking myself. Why is that? Why is that a problem? So many times you hear us as salespeople, unfortunately, we hear a symptom or we hear a buying signal or whatever you want to call it, but there'll be a specific point that's made by the person you're talking to. And immediately we fill in the blanks with assumptions, and we're off to the races trying to think about how we can put together a proposal. And the idea here is that internally, I should always ask myself why, because if I make assumptions and I think about what fills in the blanks, then I run the risk of not really understanding where the person's coming from. And so I think what we really try to do is internalize that mode. And the reason, going back to that earlier question about why do we call it the journalistic approach? Honestly, it was because we were motivated and inspired by somebody that we hired in a sales role that actually has a journalism background. And she had no intention of ever getting into sales. She was in marketing, and then she came over to our team as a sales rep. And what we noticed about her immediately was that journalistic background and wanting to uncover stories, wanting to uncover events or whatever the case might be, really had a nice fit with what we try to do as salespeople, because she would ask us the whys, and not in the annoying, why do you want me to do that, Mr. Sales Manager? But hey, why is that important in this process? Why is that important as I try to understand my customers? And so it was that engaging version of the why. And we just started thinking about that, about how wonderful that disposition is. And unfortunately, because when we're told, stop asking why, we find that to be a real mental block when we're having business conversations with people. And she really unlocked that thinking. And so I think sort of as a tribute to her, we've kind of coined the whole journalistic approach.
And did you see that her approach got different answers or different results than a typical approach might?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right from the beginning, you could see that based on the engagement, she was able to build up a much higher level of trust than others in the team who would really go about wanting to provide the what. Like, this is what we deliver, and this is how we deliver it, and this is who we can deliver it to. So there definitely was a significant difference, and you could measure it based on the dollar size of the agreements that she was able to pull together. And I would say that's consistent across salespeople who take a customer-oriented focus rather than their own business-oriented focus. So if it's less about me and my business and the product that I want to sell, and more about the customer, their challenge, what's happening with them, how you can impact the business, then the conversations become more complex, the decisions become more strategic, and the impact is much stronger.
Yeah, and in her case, what we started to also see, which it's ironic, right? We talk about this stuff and we instill this stuff in our teams, and they learn it over time. But when you had that inherent perspective that she had, I think the first leading indicator I had was that her different approach was leading to really uncovering much larger opportunities inside of organizations. And so she started out with very small accounts that had been with us historically. Maybe they weren't on much of a growth trajectory. And what we started seeing was that she would instill curiosity on the client side as well, where these deals or these opportunities that were in place in sort of in a status quo mode, she started having breakthroughs. And the reason that happened was because she was having conversations. And I think she evolved and earned the credibility with her clients to go from being a salesperson trying to sell a product to, here's a person that really cares about us, cares about our business, how we succeed. And she might have more to offer than just trying to sell us a product. And I think that was where she started to thrive as well. And fortunately, others around her saw that working. And it was really validation that taking this thinking approach pays large dividends down the road.
Yeah, and Mike keeps referring to she as an individual example, and I think it's a great example of where it worked when moving someone who wasn't in a sales role before, but now has moved into a sales role. But we've seen this work across teams that we've managed over our careers and our own personal success when taking a solution-oriented, consultative approach to selling. So as much as we talk about this one example, I think it's important to reinforce that this just works. What happens is you transition from this idea of a sales rep engaging with an organization and becoming more of a trusted advisor. And I think that's actually a good transition to some of the other questions that are in there, which are some of the other reasons why we ask questions. And many times we're asking questions to validate understanding. So I can have a conversation, think about from a journalist approach. You're going to want to have multiple sources. If your story is based on a single source, you have one throat to choke or one single point of failure, where as you ask these questions and you engage throughout the organization, you can create a much stronger story and help a customer connect dots across multiple business units.
Earlier, you mentioned how this is a unique process. It's an individual process, and it's not working from a template. But all of us like shortcuts. All of us like to have somebody say, look, this is how you do it. Ask these 7 questions. So without it being a template, how can someone get started? If this is a new concept to me, what would you tell me about, okay, throw away your template, and this is how you start using the journalistic approach?
There's that fine line where you have the opportunity to understand the types of questions you should ask. And really what we can do is we can overlay that with the sales process in itself, where in the beginning of the process, you're asking a lot of discovery questions and you're trying to understand what the business problem is that you're solving. And then there's that transition that goes into less questioning about what's going on. And some people call that open-ended questions. Don't ever ask closed-end questions. But the reality is there are times when you very much need to ask closed-ended questions because you need confirmation and you need to know that, like Mike said, you're validating that the information you have is correct. But there is that fine line between having a script where you ask the questions. And in some cases, that's exactly what a salesperson is given is once you've asked these 3 questions, it even has mapping in there that says, if you have this response, then provide this amount of data. And the problem with that is, as a person receiving that, you can tell that you're being walked through that process. That is not a genuine conversation. And I've yet to experience that where I felt like the person was actually really listening to me, because what they're thinking about is, okay, I've delivered the question, I've got the answer, now I know what I need to ask next. It's a very rote sort of process. I think in lieu of giving people the template to say, these are the questions you need to ask at this stage of the sales process, what we talk about is, when you're in the beginning of this discussion, these are the types of questions you can ask, and we can certainly give them ideas or phrases or the way we would ask questions. One of the really horrible questions people ask, and I still get asked this all the time as a buyer, is questions around budget or questions around, are you the decision maker? And sometimes you'll get those questions fired off to you, 1, 2, 3. Are you the decision maker? Can you make a decision? And do you have budget? And I give them the affirmative answers, and next thing you know, I'm being transferred to an account executive. So there's a really horrible way to provide that context. But what we try and do is give them the sort of the thinking around, where are you in the process right now? And what should some of these questions sound like? Keep the focus on what they're hearing versus what they want to ask next. And I know it sounds a little ambiguous, and that's the whole thing about a thinking process. Thinking isn't easy. And if it was, everybody would be doing it. It's much easier to give somebody a list of 10 questions to ask, score that based on the responses, and then proceed in your sales process.
And a lot of times we'll get feedback from reps around wanting more autonomy and wanting to be creative. And in my opinion, this is a great way to be creative. You should always ask questions using your own language. And those questions should have some kind of basis or foundation in what you understand about the customer. So when I think about this in general, I get back to one of the comments I made earlier, which is the who, the what, the why, the where, the when, and the how. And when you look at the story that you're creating for your customer, looking at those questions helps to identify gaps in either the information that you've captured or the solution you're trying to put together for the customer.
So a summary of what I'm hearing when you two explain the journalistic approach is sometimes people want to get to the what right away, but understanding the why helps you shape the what for that unique individual that you're talking to. Is that an accurate summary?
Jody, I think we should hire you.
Yeah. I wonder. Yeah, we should make him Catalyst sales certified by the end of this series, because either we're explaining it really well or he's really, really sharp, because he seems to get all of our concepts, which, interestingly enough, maybe you should be in sales, Jody. Maybe we can.
We know a couple of guys.
Yeah.
A couple of guys. Well, as we wrap up here then, what final words do you have to offer for the journalistic approach?
I think putting that hat on, if you want to call it the journalistic approach, or if you want to call it, a lot of people use the sort of the analogy of you meet somebody at a social event and how easy it is to talk about each other's business and ask those probing questions about the whys and the hows. It comes naturally if you apply yourself that way. And if you just realize that, and I think one of the other key points maybe that we didn't talk about is people really do want to talk about their business. They do want to talk about the things that are important to them, and knocking down that wall of that fear of feeling as a salesperson, well, if I ask why too many times, I'm going to sound like that 2-year-old. Realize that people do want to talk about their business. They do want to be successful. They want to get help from people that they feel they can get help from, and establishing yourself as a better communicator where you are that journalist. It puts you in a position where you build credibility and you have somebody that does want to have those engaging conversations. So I would say in parting that just have genuine conversations with people. Think about the whys, and maybe those are internal whys, but ask more questions to really get to the bottom of the issues that people are struggling with every day and see if you can add value.
Well, thank you for another great episode, Mike and Mike. If you want to find out more about Catalyst Sale, you can visit catalystsale.com or follow us on Twitter @CatalystSale or find us on LinkedIn. If you enjoy this show and you want to share it with your colleagues, you can find it on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or any other place you would listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to Catalyst Sale.